Hello, class. My name is Hunter Peck, and I did my research on Polly Bemis. Um, she was born around September of 1853 in northern China, where you know, she was sold into slavery by her family at the age of 16. Not much is known about how she got to the United States, but she ended up in Portland, Oregon, where an older Chinese man bought her and took her on horseback to Warren, Idaho. She was probably bought to be a concubine for the Chinese man. Um, and Warren at the time had a majority Chinese immigrant community, but the problem is that she did not fit into this community because she spoke Mandarin and the rest of the community spoke Cantonese. Um, During the 1870s, there was a lot of rampant racism against Chinese people, and it was increasing. And there was also a lot of violence towards Chinese people in the town of Warren. Um, by 1880, she had somehow come to be living with a man named Charlie Bemis. She nursed him back to health after he'd been shot, and the two became friends. They opened a boarding house a couple years later, in 1892, and that is where Polly came to be known as a humorous and assertive businesswoman. In 1894, Charlie and Polly got married, and they bought a property outside of Warren where they would live. On their new farm, they raised livestock, grew vegetables, hunted, and fished. Polly specifically loved to fish, and she liked a lot of, that kind of work that she was doing. Um, their house was very remote for the time, but they had a lot of visitors because they befriended the neighbors and people of the town, and they always had people coming over. In 1896, Polly and 22 other Chinese people were almost deported because they had failed to apply for a certificate of residence. The Geary Act of 1892 required that all Chinese immigrants in the United States were required to apply for a certificate of residence. Um, and the Polly and the 22 other Chinese people had not done that because the government official who was supposed to interview them and approve them for them had not shown up because of bad weather. So they got called to the court, had to defend themselves, and they eventually did get a certificate of residence, but they never became United States citizens because they were not allowed to at the time. Um, Polly rarely left her house after they moved to the outside of town of Warren. Um, Basically, didn't leave the house until 1919 when Charlie became bedridden, and then eventually he died in 1922. Um, and then 2 months after he died, their house burned down, and Polly moved back to Warren for a few years. Um, but during that whole time period where she never left her house, basically, her only connection to the outside world was her friend who was also named Charlie. Um, and that they basically brought her newspapers and other things, information about the outside world. Um, but after Polly moved to Warren, back to Warren after their house burned down, she allowed a lot of children to stay at her house because the only town in the area was at Warren, and a lot of families couldn't make the trip there, so they asked to have their kids live with them. And she liked kids, so she was fine with that. In 1923, Polly traveled with her friends to Grangeville to buy some new reading glasses, and this was her first experience of like the outside world and the modern world. She rode in a car for the first time. She saw her first movie and saw her first train during this trip. And then she also went to Boise and experienced more things like elevators, streetcars, and she saw like high buildings. Polly died in 1933 at her home that was rebuilt by her friend Charlie, and Charlie gave her as a housewarming present a radio, which is another modern amenity that she had not experienced yet, and she loved to listen to music on her radio. Polly might not have been a big icon for civil rights or, rich and wealthy businesswoman, but she was a Chinese woman in a town of 92% of men, or 92% men, and she survived in the Idaho wilderness, hunting and fishing for decades by herself or just with her husband, basically. Um, she was also a former slave and possibly kind of a sex slave for an old Chinese dude. Um, she basically redefines what we call a pioneer because she was a pioneer. She lived in the Idaho wilderness on a farm, hunted, fished, farmed, kept herself alive, basically did not leave her property or the wilderness. Um, Her cabin is a local historical site in Idaho, and she's been the subject of many books and documentaries because she offers a unique and interesting experience of someone who was sold as a mistress, was a slave, a woman who survived in the Idaho wilderness, and also a Chinese woman in the wilderness in America during the time where racism against the Chinese people was pretty much at an all-time high. And that it really went against the norms of the time, and it redefined how we should see, you know, who pioneers were and what they did. But yeah, that was Polly. That was Polly Bemis. Thank you.